All right, let's take you live to Washington, where world leaders are arriving for the start of day two of a summit to celebrate 75 years of the alliance. But looming over this week's event in Washington, D.C. are questions about the future of Biden's re-election this November. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has just finished speaking. He was asked just moments ago what it will mean for the alliance if Biden loses. Have a listen to what he had to say.
I expect that regardless of the outcome of the U.S. elections, the U.S. will remain a strong and staunch NATO ally for three reasons. One is that it is in the U.S. security interest to have a strong NATO. NATO is good for Europe, but it's also good for the United States. It makes the United States stronger and safer, because in NATO, the United States has something no other major power has, and that is more than 30 friends and allies. Russia doesn't have that, China doesn't have that. The United States has NATO, makes the United States stronger. The second reason why I believe that the United States will remain a strong ally is that it is broad bipartisan support for NATO in the United States. There are just now new opinion polls demonstrating the broad support for NATO among U.S. voters, but also in the U.S. Congress. I will later on today go to the U.S. Senate, and in the U.S. Congress there is strong bipartisan support for NATO. And thirdly, the main criticism from former President Trump and also from others against NATO has actually not primarily been against NATO. It has been against NATO allies not spending enough on NATO. And this has really changed. Just over the last years, we have seen a dramatic increase in defense spending across Europe and Canada, and a record high number of allies are now meeting the target of spending 2%. And those allies who are not yet there, they have clear plans in place to be at 2% soon. So.
All right, let's continue that conversation with Michael Boire in Kingston, Ontario. Michael is an assistant professor of history at Royal Military College of Canada, as well as a former NATO war planner and retired major in the Canadian Army. Michael, let's start with your reaction to Stoltenberg's response.
Well, it's positive, almost cheerful. And it's also meant, I would think, to reassure many of the political heads with him at that meeting who may be apprehensive about the American elections and how Messrs. Biden and Trump will perform and who, in fact, will win. It's having been an old NATO fellow way back, the levels of nervousness among the allies is always fairly strong when faced with any kind of challenge or threat, and we'll see how that pans out on the basis of the American elections. But clearly, Mr. Biden was addressing more of a domestic audience than it was an international or NATO audience.
And speaking to some of that optimism that you heard in Stoltenberg's voice, he also said that Russia is fully occupied with a war in Ukraine, but there's no imminent threat against NATO. How accurate is that description?
Well, I hate to say it, but we tend to systematically underplay the military might of Russia. It's gone through 2 world wars. It's beaten a long time ago the best army in the world. It's got an industrial base that is slaved, if you will, to the military effort. So I don't think we can safely underestimate what Russia will do in the future. That Ukraine and Russia seem to be at a stalemate right now is indicative, perhaps, of a situation that will continue. But Mr. Putin is looking at NATO as an alliance which has pushed itself onto his borders. Let's never forget that. In terms of realism in the international arena, we do as alliance partners and in support of Ukraine, we pose a threat, at least in the minds of Putin and his many, many followers.
And Mr. Boire, the Secretary General also said that there are several hostile acts, such as disinformation, to sabotage the organization. I mean, this is something that we've heard from world leaders across the board. Attacks with some of the fast-changing technological advancements that are out there, such as AI. How is NATO going to fight this?
Well, that's not my realm. I don't do cyber, so I can't, or AI for that matter, so I can't comment on the technicity of it. But certainly, as we've seen on the net, there's an awful lot of disinformation wandering around. And I would suggest that people who look at social media and listen to it, and dare I say, participate in it, have to be exceedingly careful as what they're prepared to believe. And what the net does is it demands a population that is sophisticated and educated to actually put the information they hear and see in perspective, because there is an awful lot of it out there that is simply wrong, and it's meant to have an effect.
And let's talk a little bit about Canada's role in this summit. We've talked about some of the pressure that they're receiving, given that they still don't have a public plan to reach the 2% NATO defense spending target. How do you think this will play among our allies at the summit?
Well, I lived and I worked in that NATO ambiance for many years, and I can assure you that there are times when a given country is up and other times it's down, depending on how it participates in NATO's operations. Canada has a very up and down reputation. Sometimes we're in and red hot, and sometimes we're not. The 2% figure is meant to embarrass more than it is to ensure income. We have to remember that as Canadians, we live in a society that does not have a defense, a security, or a foreign policy culture. Canadians are simply unaware, and I can assure you, as a professor who has to teach young university students, that is very well shared. Canadians see themselves as being, quite wrongly, I would think, as being safe in a very dangerous world, and that's the kind of widespread Canadian attitude that Canada's political leaders have to deal with. So it's up to them if they, and of course, it's up to them in a country that seems to be drifting to the right. So let's see how our political leadership handles that in the days and weeks and months ahead, because the world, as I said before, is a very dangerous place. And to turn away from that danger and not be willing to hoist it aboard and prepare to do something about it is a dangerous course of action.
And Mr. Boire, given, as you said there, that maybe might in the form of money isn't exactly what Canada can offer, what do they need to do to give assurances to their allies about their commitment to NATO?
It's an alliance. It begins with paying dues in terms of how we're seen by the 31 other members of the alliance. It's become a cause célèbre, the 2% figure. Yes, there are other ways, and our political leadership has said there are other ways, and I believe them. But nonetheless, in terms of the alliance, in terms of coming across and being one of the boys or girls in the alliance and punching above our weight, that still has to be seen. And again, Canadians don't see it that way. Canadians are non-military, and as I said before, we're lacking the cultures to really take this seriously. And Canadians as a group sleepwalk through their existences. And our political leadership answers to that, as they should. Well,
I appreciate your insight on this. Thank you so much for that conversation. That was former NATO war planner and retired major in the Canadian Army, Michael Boire. He joined us from Kingston, Ontario.